I'm really happy to be here. So you were all sitting here. You just heard Roshi Jones talk, right? So I'll tell you something about Dick Cheney. I have a friend who lives in Napa Valley, and every time I go to see my friend, he lives kind of obscurely, so I have to have the GPS. But every time I go near his house, the GPS goes haywire, and his house doesn't exist on the GPS. And the reason for that is that he had really bad, life-threatening cancer. And I believe it was while he was vice president, Dick Cheney went to visit him. Came from Washington to California to visit him and sit with him and give him a hug, and because they're old friends. They were in you may not, this seems unbelievable now, but there used to be something called the War on Poverty. Do you know that? There was an idea that the government would do something about poverty. It seems like, what? But those of you who are old enough to remember this, and guess who was presiding over the War on Poverty? Richard Nixon, because he had inherited it from Johnson. And so these two men, my friend and Dick Cheney, were colleagues working in the War on Poverty in Washington during the Nixon administration. So Dick Cheney came to visit my friend who was, it looked like, dying of cancer. And that's why the Secret Service jammed up the GPS and forgot to unjam it, I guess, 25 years later. And that's why I'm always lost whenever I go to visit my friend. And so my friend, who doesn't have the same politics as Dick Cheney, really appreciated that Dick Cheney he loves Dick Cheney and thought that Dick Cheney was a wonderful person. So it just goes to show you that whatever you think you know, it's more complicated than you think, right? It's more complicated than you think. And Dick Cheney being nice to my friend doesn't absolve him of whatever sins and crimes he may have committed, but it just goes to show you that Dick Cheney is not who you think he is. He's not the Dick Cheney person that was in the movie. I guess I didn't see the movie. I want to see it, but Christian Bale's a great actor. So, well, I was moved by everything Joan was saying, and I don't have that much more to add, actually. And by the way, what she was saying at the end there, her book is really good. I actually read it. I read it closely, and you have to read it closely. And I think what she was saying at the end is very important, not something that people think about. The idea of moral suffering, that's what I got from the book that I thought was most important. That we, because you don't know you're in moral suffering, usually, until you reflect on it and realize that you are. So I think that was a really valuable contribution, which, as far as I am aware, at least in my small reading, is unique. So thank you for the whole book, and especially that. Anyway, we all are aware that we're living in dramatic times. It's impossible to tell whether the times are more dramatic than other times, because you can't ever know that. There were other times when people were absolutely convinced the world was coming to an end, just like we're convinced the world is coming to an end. But we really know the world is coming to an end because we have science. They also really knew the world was coming to an end because they had religion, so they knew. But anyway, it's tough times, and nobody can ignore it. But I'm thinking to myself, what is really going on, and what really is the world? And it occurs to me that we are all imagining this world. This is a fact. We're living in a world that's some combination of raw data that our senses perceive, and then our minds and our experiences take that raw data and create a world. So we're actually collectively in a spell of imagining a world in a particular way. And it's not that the world is not that way, it's just that it's not just that way. It's a lot of other ways too. So one way of looking at the world we live in now is that it's a tremendous failure of the imagination. We have not cultivated the imagination widely enough and interestingly enough to overcome the cribbed and crabbed and constricted imaginative sense that we have, that is, we're so mesmerized by all the data. Because we could measure it, we can measure everything, we think that what is measured is the only thing that's real. But there is reality that is immeasurable. And we heard last night, I think last night, the word inconceivable, which is a big word in Mahayana Buddhism. The inconceivable is also a part of our everyday lives. And so we need to open ourselves to that. And we need to not only open ourselves to it, but actively cultivate it as a daily practice. And so that's how I'm thinking of spiritual practice right now, as a way of cultivating the imagination. So I wrote this book, The World Could Be Otherwise, out of a sense of real urgency. Because now, I used to think spiritual practice was really good for people who wanted to do it and felt called to it, and the rest of everybody else could safely forget about it. But now I think, no. Now I think everybody has to find a way to engage spiritually, to open up the imagination and open up the heart, which is the same thing, because we'll never get out of this alive unless we collectively do that, every one of us. And when a critical mass of us will do that, then what seems at the moment absolutely impossible will be possible, will be commonplace. So it's really important that we all be, in the terms I'm using in this book, bodhisattvas. We all have to be bodhisattvas now. I think it's not an option, it's a necessity. Bodhisattvas are spiritual heroes. They're like the man of La Mancha who dreams the impossible dream. Da 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 da. That's a bodhisattva. Just keeps on going, no matter what. Keeps on going. You whack her down, she pops back up. You whack her down again, she pops back up again, and she just keeps on going. Where? Straight ahead. Is she going to get there? Of course not. But it makes no difference. She keeps going forever and ever and ever and ever, because that's her heart, that's her joy, that's her love. And I think we have to all be bodhisattvas now. We have to be undaunted by the bad news. Because the bad news is bad news within a certain framework of the world. We can't ignore it. It's important. Like Joan was saying, we can't paint a veneer of emptiness all over it and say, oh, everything's fine. It's not fine. But it's not the only thing that this world is, and it's not the only thing that our hearts are. We have to be bodhisattvas. So that's the idea. So I'm going to read a little bit from the book, because I like to read. I have a bad writing habit. And I like to write. I can't stop. It's very bad for Zen people to write. It's embarrassing, But what can you do? Everybody's stuck with being who they are. So I'll tell you a story that begins the book. It's a story about the French surrealist poet Robert Desnos. So he was Jewish, and now it's World War II times. The Nazis have overcome the French government. So Desnos goes underground to fight for the resistance. He was captured, he was sent to the camps. So one day, along with many other men, Desnos is crowded onto the bed of one of the trucks that transports prisoners from the barracks. The men understand where they're going because every day they see the trucks full, leaving the barracks. Every day they see the trucks come back empty. The men who were transported are never seen again. They know where they're going. So they're in the truck bed. Of course, they're all kind of stunned. Nobody's looking at anybody. Nobody's talking. The truck arrives. The prisoners very slowly, reluctantly descend. It's like they're in a dream. And the guards are always joking, as prison guards do, to break the tension. They're always joking and bantering and having fun. But when they see these men descending from the truck, they can't keep that up. They catch the mood. So everything is very somber and silent. But all of a sudden, the mood is shattered when one of the men in the line of prisoners, it turns out that it was Desnos, whirls around and grabs the palm of the hand of the prisoner behind him. It turns out Desnos is a palm reader. He's reading the guy's palm. And he becomes overwhelmed with excitement and joy. Because he says, look at this lifeline. It's long. You're going to live a long, long time. And look at this. 3 gorgeous children and a beautiful wife. You're going to be traveling. You're going to be a wealthy guy. I'm so happy for you. It's wonderful. And everybody goes, what? And the other prisoners, at first they're stunned. And then the next thing they do, everybody puts out their palm because they're so excited. And Desnos is reading everybody's palm. And it turns out everybody has the same kind of prediction: a long life, a family, children, happiness, everything great, traveling all around the world. This one is even going to America. Can you believe it? You're going to be living in America. Your children are going to be Americans. It's fabulous. Nobody can believe this. And the excitement is contagious. All the prisoners are now, instead of, in this long plodding line, they're now in a clot, patting each other on the back, how excited they are for each other, how happy they are for each other. But even more astonishingly, the guards, don't know what to make of this, and it affects them. Just like the prisoners, the guards had been living in the middle of a dark spell, a dream in which the marching of men to slaughter was a normal and acceptable everyday occurrence. But now, all of a sudden, with this absurd and unprecedented event, this sort of sudden bursting onto the scene of an alternative reality, that spell was broken. And the guards become confused and frankly disoriented because their reality was now cast into doubt. And they don't know anymore in that moment what is real and what is not. Perhaps their better natures, long suppressed, in an effort to conform to the Nazi madness that had defined their world, perhaps suffering from severe moral injury, right, without being able to acknowledge it, acknowledge their grief, their guilt, their horror. Maybe all of that was in them the whole time was stirred up by Desnos's powerful commitment to his absurd and yet perhaps not absurd vision. We don't know. what was going on in the minds and hearts of the guards, but we do know that they are so undone by this jolly scene in front of them that they do not know what to do, and they cannot go through with business as usual. So they load the prisoners back onto the truck, and they send them back to the barracks. And Desnos was not executed. These men were not executed. Through the spontaneous exercise of imagination, which is precisely the sort of move Desnos made in his poetry, he and these men were saved from execution. So I wish I could tell you that Desnos lived a long life and had many children and lives here in Los Angeles, but in fact, he didn't live much longer. He was not executed, but he didn't live much after the war. He got typhus and he died pretty young, but he was not executed. So I first heard this story. It's an amazing story, isn't it? Did a lot of you not hear it before? Yeah, it's an amazing story. I first heard it at the Jewish Museum in San Francisco when I was participating in a poetry reading, which was called something like Living Jewish Poets Read the Work of Dead Jewish Poets. So a bunch of local Jewish poets were invited to the Jewish Museum, and we were all to select, some works by our favorite dead Jewish poet. And my friend Alan Bernheimer, who translates Desnos, was presenting works from Desnos, translated from the French, and he told this story. And I was stunned by it, and afterward I said, Alan, where did you hear that from? And he said, I heard it from Susan Griffin. So I don't know Susan Griffin. She's a writer in the Bay Area, but I got a hold of her and I said, this story is too good to be true. Could it really be true? Do you ever think it's true? And she said, well, I can't really verify it, but I got it from my friend Odette, who was a concentration camp survivor, although she wasn't at the scene. But she got it from someone who she says was there, so I believe it was a true story. So I thought about this for a while. And one day I realized this is definitely a true story. It has a truth power. And that truth power changes me, changes my life, changes the way I look at the world, think about myself, think about my activity. This story expresses something that is essential about our being human. So when I say I'm sure it's true, I don't mean that I'm 100% certain of it as an objectifiably verifiable occurrence, although I actually do think it happened that way, more or less. But I can't be 100% sure, but I can be 100% sure that this is a true story because I feel its truth in me. It moves me. And the imagination is that powerful. It's essential for our humanness. When you think about it, what is religion and spirituality after all but the profound working out of our imaginations? Where do the stories from the Bible and all religious texts, the Buddhist sutras, where do they come from? They come from the deepest place in the human heart, as do all folk tales, all myths, all rhymes, all poems, all plays, novels, anecdotes, music, ritual, pictures, dreams. All these things are imaginative projections that rise up from the unconscious to expand the soul, because we need the soul to be expanded. We can't really live in this world with its crushing weight of materiality. We have to move beyond the habitual one-dimensional perspective of our outer perceptions and fearful emotions, which are also natural to us. So we have both, right? We're fearful, scared vulnerable creatures, and we're also magnificent bodhisattvas, both. If we only have one side of that, and we don't cultivate the other side of that, life is too much, and we'll all become a mess, like so many of us are these days, right? We need to go beyond the possible to the impossible. And it takes imagination to imagine the impossible. So now, I want to, the next thing I want to say is that, so, okay, you get the picture, imagination, you understand what I'm saying. But the next thing is that love is the supreme act of the imagination, when you think about it, right? In order to, like, it's okay, it makes sense that you fulfill my needs, I need a friend, I need a companion, let's be together. That doesn't take much imagination, because we have needs. But to actually love somebody, right? To go beyond your needs and love somebody, to think of that person as oneself, as more important to oneself than oneself, that's an amazing achievement, right? That's like perhaps the highest imaginative achievement that a human being is capable of. And that's what bodhisattvas do. That's the imagination that the bodhisattvas exercise in their hearts. So I want to, this is a funny thing, but I'm quoting another book of mine in this book. It's odd, but, and this is a book of mine, a book of poetry. It's a poetry diary of a trip, a pilgrimage trip we took to Japan in 2010. And so I made a diary of the trip in verse, short verses, sort of fake Japanese short verses. So this is a recording that I made of a Dharma talk given to us by our dear friend and teacher, Hoitsu Suzuki, when we were visiting Eheiji at the time. He was a teacher at Eheiji. So here's what he said in my poetic verse. Hojo-san, east, west, a person of zazen. Zazen is Zen meditation. East, west, a person of zazen is the same. Grandmother mind, the kind heart, is imagination. Feeling for another, see them as yourself, takes imagination. Imagination expands the heart. One day woke, heard sound in both ears, sudden, hearing loss. My eyes don't work right either. Age is slowly melting my body. With each loss, there's gain. My ears, my eyes, more mine now than ever before not. So, when I lose my life to death, will my life be owned by me more than it ever was? Isn't that a great teaching? Who would ever think such a thing, right? Imagination expands the heart so much that we're capable of understanding others as ourselves and ourselves as not belonging to us. What if you actually felt yourself as not being yours and not belonging to you? What if you lived your body that way every day? It's almost impossible to understand this. What we feel inside, the currents of meaning and meaninglessness, of love and loneliness, of possibility and impossibility, what every one of us has inside of us, is measureless. We'll never come to the end of it. Who can understand who they really are? What makes us the way we are? What makes us do what we do? Feel what we feel? In a moment, whatever we feel, the entire universe, literally, right, produced that moment of feeling in us. Who can fathom it? Only the imagination is deep and wide enough to open us to the profound healing in which we will feel in ourselves the feeling of others. And you know what? When we feel that depth of our own feeling and that feeling for one another, whatever happens, whatever outcomes we're facing in the future are okay, because we're doing it together. We're doing it with love and connection to one another. So, of course, we would like something to happen and other things not to happen, but whatever happens, we can be totally fearless when there's love, that kind of love. And so the Bodhisattva path is for the purpose of going as far as we possibly can in this short lifetime to develop that kind of love. And it's completely doable, completely doable. And so in the book, I talk about the Bodhisattva path of the 6 paramitas, et cetera, you all know what they are, I guess. Generosity, ethical conduct, patient forbearance, joyful effort, meditation, transcendent wisdom. So what are these practices? How do we practice them? And then at the end of every chapter, I give a little, some pointers, some actual practices. So it's a daily effort. It goes on and on and on. We don't need to worry about getting it right. We don't need to worry about finishing the job. We just need to do it every single day. Do it. And everybody can do it. Everybody can do it. And when you do it, I guess Joan was just saying, when you do it, you realize, do you really make the bed in your hotel? You really do that? My life has now changed. From now on, I'm doing this. I don't do that. I'm going to now do it. This is a great thing. You make it totally, perfectly. Not perfectly, but yeah, this is a great thing. But that's true. That's because that's a bodhisattva practice, right? That's the practice of thinking. There's actually a person coming in here, and I'm going to think of that person, when I leave the room. Yeah. Anyway, I'm gonna stop now, and with a poem, and then that's why I'm happy the lights are up, because I can see all of you, and then maybe you have things to say, and I can interact with the things you have to say. And if there's no mic, I will repeat in a loud voice in case somebody can't hear. But anyway, I asked Alan. Alan had not translated this particular Desnos poem, but it's one of my favorites, and I asked him to translate for the book. He and Steve Emerson translated this Desnos poem called Ebony Life. This is a great poem for our time. A frightening stillness will mark that day, and the shade from street lamps and fire alarms will sap the light. All will go silent, the quietest and the noisiest. The squalling infants will finally stop squalling. The tugboats, the locomotives, the wind will silently glide. And the great voice that comes from far away will be heard, passing over the city, long awaited. Then, at the millionaire's hour, when the dust, the stones, and the absence of tears arrange the sun's dress on the great deserted squares, finally, the voice will be heard coming. It will growl endlessly at the doors. It will pass over the city, ripping out flags and shattering windows. We will hear it. What silence before it, but even greater the silence that it will not disturb, but that it will charge with approaching death, that it will wither and condemn. Oh, day of sorrows and joys, the day to come when the voice will pass over the city. A ghostly gull told me that the voice loved me as much as I loved it, and that this great, terrible silence was my love, that the wind carrying the voice was the great revolt of the world, and that the voice would favor me. Yeah. So do we have maybe like 10 minutes for questions? 5 minutes? 8 minutes. We have 8 minutes for whatever you would like to say, and I really would like to hear from you, because you're talking and you're thinking to yourself, so what are they all thinking, right? What are they thinking now? And that's why I like to hear from at least a few people to see what everybody's thinking. What are you thinking? Oh, there you go. Oh, and there is a mic. Wonderful. Thank you.
Hi, how are you?
I'm good. Thanks. Good. How are you?
So you were talking about the French poet. Is it
Desnos? D-E-S-N-O-S, yeah.
And you were talking about imagination, and it was just incredible listening to that. And then you questioned whether it was true or not. And I was thinking, does it matter if it's true? That the power of imagination can sometimes, even if it's momentarily real, can take, as it did, those people to a place which exceeded any kind of suffering or pain and united them through this power of imagination and love. For me, when I was listening to it, because my first thing was, is it true? And then for me, I dropped that idea of whether it was true, because it was true in that moment for them. And so the beauty about the story is, of course, they went back on the bus, and that the guards had a kind of transformation themselves, right? A recognition. And so there were several layers to that story. And I suppose my question is, if it is a question, is does it matter if it's true? You know?
Mm-hmm.
Mm.
Right. Yes, all of that. But what you're saying, and I was trying to say this. We have a concept of what something means, whether something's true or not, and our concept is historical truth, which we define in a particular way, even though, as everybody knows, the past is totally unreliable. Nobody knows what actually happened in the past. But still, we have an idea of historical truth that is our idea. It's not, in other words, the idea of truth is an idea, right? It's an idea. And scientific objectivity is an idea that has been very useful to us in many, many ways, but it's an idea. Like the other day in my Dharma seminar at home in the Bay Area, we were studying early Buddhist sutras, the earliest Buddhist sutras. And people always study the same sutras, the ones that have teachings in them, but I don't like the ones that have teachings in them. I like to study the ones that have no teachings in them, but just stories. And the stories, when we were studying those sutras, we realized, they come from an oral tradition. And they have demons, and they have gods, and they have people flying around in hells and heavens and all that. People think that Buddhism is very irrational and reasonable. But actually, if you read the sutras, there's all kinds of many, many hells, many heavens. Deities are always talking to the Buddhists, talking to this god or that god, and people are flying around. And so we're reading all this, and I was saying, we were talking about, this was true. All the things that are in those sutras are true. The people who read them understood them to be true. They didn't understand that they were metaphors, as we would now say, or imagery, or mythical. They would understand them to be true because they didn't have the same idea of historical truth that we now have. It's an idea that we have about truth. So yes, the story, that's what I meant when I said, definitely the story of Desnos is true. True in a way that transcends our ideas of historical truth. And it may be that the truth that transcends our ideas of historical truth may be a more valuable, a more salvific truth than, maybe we've let our imaginations be colonized by small ideas of what's true and what's real. Maybe what's true and what's real is bigger than we think right now. That's my whole point. But I'll close with another story, because I think I'm getting signs are telling me that not much time. So there's a big fire. This is one from the Jataka stories. The world is on fire. Burning, 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 burning. And everybody's, nothing to be done. But this one parrot, tiny little parrot, says, no, of course there's something to be done. I'm going to put this fire out. So she flies across to the ocean. She fills her wings with drops of water, and she flies over the conflagration. She flaps her wings, and a couple drops fly onto the fire. And she flies back to the ocean, and she gets some more, and she goes back. She's doing this back and forth. She's really tired. It's really exhausting, but she keeps on doing it drop by drop by drop. Doesn't seem to affect the giant fire at all, but she keeps doing it and doing it and doing it. And then an eagle is flying over and says, what are you doing? This is hopeless. There's no way that you're going to do this. And the parrot says, never mind, I'm busy. I'm sorry, I don't have time to talk to you. I've got to go. She goes to the next one. Up in heaven, the gods see this, and they're so touched and moved by this activity of this little parrot that it brings them to tears. And the gods start weeping, 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 and all the gods are weeping and weeping. And guess what happens? Puts the fire out. All those God tears. True story.